Shalom and welcome again to another edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address, and I greatly appreciate you being with us. With these podcasts, we hope to explore some of the issues that touch us, our families, and our communities in light of the revolution in longevity, which is reshaping our Jewish world. We appreciate your support. You can follow us on our website, jewishsacredaging.com. And if you want to contact me about ideas or comments or future ideas for shows, just email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. And it is with a great deal of pleasure that we welcome to today's Seekers of Meaning show, Nora Katz, the Director of Heritage and Interpretation, which is something I got to ask you that title, for the Institute of Southern Jewish Life. Nora, welcome. Nice to see you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Great. So first of all, you're going to have to tell me what the Director of Heritage and what are you interpreting?
Sure. So I guess I can tell you a little bit more about the Institute of Southern Jewish Life to give you some context. So as you mentioned, I'm the Director of Heritage and Interpretation at the Institute of Southern Jewish Life in Jackson, Mississippi. And the Institute, or the ISJL, supports, connects, and celebrates Jewish life in the American South through a variety of different program areas, including education programming, rabbinical services, and cultural programs. And so my job as Director of Heritage and Interpretation is to interpret and share the history and the legacy of Jewish life in the American South through public programs, trips and tours, historic preservation, and a lot more. In a nutshell, I do public history programming telling the story of Jews in the South.
So this is, thank you. This is very, very fascinating. And I really appreciate you being with us. I remember from my first student congregation many years ago in a galaxy that really is very far away. I was a student rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in a place called Dothan, Alabama.
Yep.
Yep. Which was one of the great years I had. And it was 1968, 1969. It was a presidential election. It was fascinating. And it was through my visiting Dothan every other weekend from Cincinnati that I sort of got an inkling into what this was like in the spread of the Jewish community in the South, especially in the 1800s, which, of course, growing up in Philadelphia, we never knew about, just knew about. Talk to me about the fascination and the idea of how these communities developed. They developed a lot with peddlers, if I remember correct, Jewish peddlers who came over in a German immigration and sort of like to move west. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I in my former life, I was a historian of the Atlantic world. And so that's sort of how I think about this history a lot of the time. So Jews have been in the United States since really the 17th century. And the first Jews in what we now know as the South arrived in Charleston, South Carolina in the 1690s. And at that point, if you can imagine a map of the Atlantic Ocean and specifically the Caribbean in your mind, you can imagine sort of Savannah and Charleston as not so much the southern United States, but as the northernmost reaches of what the great Southern Jewish historians Dale and Ted Rosengarten call the Gulf Caribbean plantation region. So there are all of these sort of economic, political, and social and familial relationships between Jews across the Atlantic because of sort of the diaspora that was happening because of a number of sort of policies and political shifts and anti-Semitism in Europe. And so Jews were moving around Europe and then into places in the Caribbean and in South America, like Suriname, like Recife. And so Jews are moving sort of all throughout this world. And so in sort of the 17th century and the early 18th century, Savannah and Charleston really are the northernmost reaches of this sort of Caribbean economic zone. And so Jews are arriving in those places again, as I said, sort of in the 17th century, coming from England, from English colonies, and from other places as well. There's a significant sort of Sephardic movement to what's now the United States at that time as well. And South Carolina at the time was sort of more welcoming than many other colonies. Freedom of religion was sort of guaranteed by the new colonial government. And so Jews had a lot of opportunities in the South that they might not have in, say, Massachusetts colony. And so Jews are also arriving in Savannah. And so these sort of early Jews are arriving. They're becoming sort of entrenched in colonial society. They're doing a variety of jobs. But the sort of classic Southern Jewish immigration story is a Jewish person in sort of the late 18th through the 19th century, coming from Western Europe, say Germany, or maybe even Alsace-Lorraine, coming to the South, either through a port in the north and traveling south, or through a port closer to the south, like New Orleans or Galveston, or through Savannah and Charleston, and traveling through the South and working as a peddler. Peddling was a really common profession for Jews in Europe because often they weren't allowed to own businesses. They were maybe not allowed to be in certain towns, and so they could travel around. And so many peddlers in Europe were peddlers for their entire lives. And so it was something that Jews knew well. And so when they arrived in what's now the United States, and then when it eventually became the United States, it was a career path that worked well because the South was so agrarian, so rural. And so there was really a need for people to travel through the South selling goods that weren't necessarily available to people because they weren't in a town where there was like a central general store. And the typical peddler in the South was not a peddler forever. The typical peddler was a peddler for, between 2 and 3 years, and then would sort of earn enough money to be able to settle in a growing town or a growing city and work in a business or start a business. So that's kind of the classic story, is that sort of young men from a Jewish community would come to the South, earn enough money to bring the rest of their families to the United States.
Yeah, it's fascinating because in my travels and just, studying history, that line in the South of so many what we would call department stores with Jewish names, really had their start from these peddlers who, as you said, would stop like in Dothan, and they became the department store. It's fascinating. Yeah. The Institute. Talk to me a little bit about because the Institute, probably in a lot of the Jewish communities that we have now, and religious schools and adult education, a lot of people don't know that this resource is available. When did the Institute for Southern Jewish Life start? And give me a little bit of history of the Institute.
Sure. So the Institute, as it exists today, in a couple of days, we're going to celebrate our 21st anniversary as an organization. So we were founded in 2000. But the Institute has a history before that as well. So our founder, Macy Hart, was the director of Jacob's Camp, which is a URJ summer camp in Utica, Mississippi, which is about 45-minute drive south of Jackson. And so he was really instrumental in sort of getting that camp started, and he ran it for a very long time. And there is this sort of apocryphal story that I don't think actually is that apocryphal, which is that folks would sometimes drop their kids off at camp with objects from their synagogues, with sort of family heirlooms that told the story of Jewish life in the South. Because they were like, what are we going to do? What do we do with these things? So Macy actually started a museum on the grounds of Jacob's Camp in the 1980s. And then he left camp in 2000 to found the ISJL. And the museum sort of was absorbed into us. And the museum is now its own separate institution, separate 501c3. They're sort of a sister organization of ours. But, for me as a historian, it's really amazing that this organization really was born out of this understanding of sort of the rich legacy of Jews in the South, and this really clear understanding of the need to tell this story and to preserve this history. So that continues to be sort of a through line in the work that we do even 21 years later.
Well, so you have to do me a favor, because I know Macy for many, many years when I used to work at the URJ, and through a mutual friend of ours who is my closest friend, Rabbi Jakowski. And tell Macy that I said hello. Please do. Please
I
do.
certainly will. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Institute does its educational programs. Does it help find rabbis for some of the smaller towns in the South?
Absolutely. So a big part of what we do is connecting communities that don't have full-time rabbis, which many communities across the country don't have full-time rabbis. Right. Connecting those communities with rabbis, either our director of rabbinical services, our rabbi who's actually on staff with us, as well as rabbis from across the country who want to come to the South and work with and meet with communities. So that's absolutely a part of what we do. Our director of rabbinical services will, in non-pandemic times, travel around and lead Shabbat services, right, holiday services, life cycle events, weddings, bar mitzvahs. There's always some work to do with conversion students. So that's a really wonderful part of sort of our portfolio of work.
I know in pre-pandemic times, in full disclosure, I actually have done some work with Anne, who's I think based in New Orleans, in some of the smaller cities doing for our Jewish sacred aging work. The history of the Jewish communities of the South, it's fascinating. As you mentioned Savannah, you mentioned Charleston, New Orleans, the Galveston Project, which funneled, I know, a lot of individuals into the Texas congregations. But there's this string, I remember from talking to Jake, whose region covered Texas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, a part of Arkansas. He spent a lot of time. In fact, I think he started the original new small congregations program for the URJ many, many years ago. There's a lot of these congregations who are disappearing. The demographics have changed. Talk to me how a congregation that says, okay, we're really not viable anymore. We have this building, some of these beautiful old buildings. They contact the Institute, correct? How do you help, to be blunt about it, how do you help close a community down? What do you do with that? How do you do that?
Sure. So I'd like to sort of zoom out first, because there's sort of a reason that these congregations may decline, may lose membership. And this is sort of the case across the country, is that a lot of folks are moving from small towns to bigger cities. There's sort of a changing in demographics. And in the South, that happens because of sort of the mechanization of agricultural labor. Jewish workers are doing different types of jobs. The sort of phenomenon of the Jewish family-owned small business in a town is disappearing a little bit because of sort of the rise of big box stores and now online retail. And so there are, plenty of places, especially in the rural South, where those congregations are sort of declining in numbers. So the ISJL is not necessarily in the business of really working with, how do I say this? The ISJL is not really in the business of specifically working with congregations that are closing down. We, of course, are happy to offer support in many ways. There are lots of other great resources out there for folks who are doing that work. I'm thinking especially of the Jewish Community Legacy Project, for example. But I am always sort of happy from my perspective as a public historian to help congregations think through, okay, what do we do with our objects? What do we do with our archives? What do we do with these historical materials? Right. So, that's a big question. And I always tell folks that really, the number one place to go is to a local historical society, a local museum, a local archive, because really we want to be keeping these resources in their communities, right? So the story of Jewish life, say in, Pine Bluff, Arkansas, is really important. And it's also important in Pine Bluff. And so wanting to sort of keep those resources in the community, I think, is really important from my perspective as well. But also understanding, yeah, exactly. And so sort of keeping in mind that a lot of these congregations are also part of this larger story. And so that's where one of the ISJL's great projects, the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities, comes in. This is a resource that is essentially as old as the ISJL, that's maintained and edited and written by the director of our history department, who I work very closely with. And the encyclopedia is a free online resource that includes concise but rich articles about every community in the South that has ever had a Jewish population. We have this wonderful resource, the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities, that includes concise, rich articles about every community in the South that has ever had a Jewish presence. And so that's a really helpful resource to sort of understand the interconnectedness of these communities and also see sort of some of the big themes and patterns in the story of Jewish life in the South.
So if somebody wants to connect with you, I mean, obviously there's a website and stuff like that. And how do they do? What's the connection to the ISJL? What's the website, etc.?
Yeah. So our website is isjl.org. You can find all of our contact information, including my email address, on the website. I'm always happy to hear from folks. The encyclopedia is also available on our website. You'll find it really easily, as well as all of our resources.
So, Nora, the Institute deals with Southern Jewish life, but do you connect with congregations outside, quote, the South for resources?
Yeah.
And I mean, the museum is tied to the Institute. So for example, and when I was regional director, a while ago, but we had a lot of these small cities, very, very small towns, a lot of coming out of the steel mills. And as the Northeastern demography and economy changed, a lot of those little congregations are either non-existent anymore. So if a congregation in the Northeast or the Plains or someplace, they wanted to preserve their artifacts and history, would this institute take them, or would you refer them to someplace else?
So I'll just reiterate that the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience is now a totally separate institution that you can learn about at msje.org. So the ISJL is not a collecting institution. Always happy to provide our expertise to folks because my background is in collections and archives and museums as well. But we are not. The ISJL is not specifically collecting anything. Our sort of historical, yeah.
No, it's important to know because I think there's in some people's minds, there may be this, well, the two are linked, but now they're two separate entities.
Yes, they're wonderful friends and collaborators, but separate institutions. Mm-hmm.
I understand. The denominational, the ISJL is non-denominational, correct?
Correct. We use the term trans-denominational to describe our work. We partner with communities really across the spectrum of affiliation. Statistically, most of our communities are Reform communities because that tends to be the majority of what's in the United States and especially in the South. But we also partner with conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionists across the board.
Now, I wanted you to talk a little bit about the resource material for education, because there may be congregations or leaders or who will listen to this or watch this and say, well, we know nothing about this. This would be a great adult education program. What do you offer to, let's say, if I'm a rabbi at a congregation in St. Louis, and this sounds, because that's on the border anyway, and what kind of programs would you offer educationally to existing congregations who want to learn more about the Jews of the South?
Absolutely. So this happens to be sort of part of my zone at the ISJL. There are a number of different options. Our historian on staff is a wonderful sort of scholar and lecturer, and he's always available to give lectures anywhere in the country. I am as well. A big part of my work is planning what we call Southern Jewish heritage tours for congregations from across the country and around the world who want to come to the South, learn about the South, and especially learn about sort of how Southern Jewish history intersects with other parts of sort of the Southern story, especially the civil rights movement. And so because of COVID, because we haven't been able to travel, I've developed a new program called the ISJL Virtual Vacation that is a monthly video series. We've been doing it since August. And the virtual vacation is monthly, hour-long, really engaging episodes that tell the story of Jewish life in the American South, hitting on different themes, meeting different people, visiting different places to really celebrate the history and culture of the South. And so I've been able to adapt some of those into specific presentations for communities. But that's all another free resource that's available on the ISJL's website. So there are lots of ways to connect with us. We're always thrilled to talk to people more about Jewish life in the South. How much
work in these virtual tours, in addition to the impact of the civil rights movement. I'm sure you get questions all the time about. Well, I'm not. I'm going to. Do you get? Let me rephrase that. Do you get questions all the time about the role of the Southern Jewish experience in the Civil War?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say that there are definitely there are absolutely questions about that. And that is a complicated story, as is every story. The Southern Jewish community was, I always say that sort of the politics of Southern Jews the politics of white Southern Jews are approximately the same as the politics of other white people of their same economic and social standing. So Jews are involved in the Civil War, fighting on both sides. Jews are involved in the leadership of the Confederacy in a number of ways. Judah P. Benjamin is an example of that, but there are, of course, others. And Jews are also enslaving people at about the same rates as their fellow white people of their same sort of economic and social standing. So that's certainly a question. I think it's not a conversation that has been had at large in sort of the American Jewish community, because there is this belief that, we have the story of Passover, we have the story of Exodus. Why would a Jewish person ever enslave someone? And that's, of course, just not true. It's not. The reality is that Jewish people were participating in the American economy before 1865, just as much as everyone else. And so that's a really important story, I think, and something that I always make sure that we're telling, and that we're telling that story and trying to reckon with that history through our work and our programs.
Yeah, I think it's very important, because the majority of people, the majority of our community, I agree with you, are not aware of the level of involvement in many ways with the Confederacy and slave trading, and part of that triangle that you alluded to at the beginning of the conversation.
Absolutely.
In the Caribbean, the triangle. There is also, we talk a lot about with the Institute of smaller congregations, but do you interface a lot with this tremendous number, and growing in many ways, number of larger congregations, especially in the big cities in the South, as the demographics have moved from the Northeast, perhaps, into moving congregations in Charlotte and Atlanta and other parts? Do you do a lot of work with the larger congregations, for the want of a better term?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were really founded to serve those sort of smaller congregations that might not have access to those resources, but our programs are just as available to those larger congregations. And we do partner with them in numerous ways, through our education program, through our cultural programs, through our sort of history and heritage programming. The Jewish South is far more urban now than it was even 30 years ago. I mean, in the South is far more urban now than it was.
Right.
And so there has really been a boom in Jewish communities in sort of the Sun Belt, in places like Atlanta and Houston and Miami and Jacksonville. But there also have been sort of smaller growth areas around sort of higher education and government and kind of tech in places like Nashville and Austin and Raleigh-Durham. And so, Jewish growth is in those places is sort of reflective of general growth in those cities. So as much as there are places in the South where the Jewish population is dwindling, there are also places where it's really growing. And I think Atlanta especially is a great example of that.
Well, I also know, like in Phoenix and part of the Arizona. And then the Institute really is a national organization, correct? So you deal with congregations small, how far do you define the South? I mean, do you go to New Mexico?
Sure. So we are, so we are a regional organization. We certainly serve folks nationally through some of our programs, in that we are educating them about the South. But really, we serve a 13-state southern region. So the furthest west we're going is Oklahoma and Texas, and we go to the East Coast, as far north as Virginia. So Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia. We serve northern Florida. South Florida doesn't really need us so much. Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas.
So a huge diversity too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your experience, how different is Southern Jewish life from Northern Jewish life right now?
So I think that's a great question. One of my colleagues sort of says that really sort of the distinction and the difference is perhaps urban versus rural more than it is northern versus southern. So a rural congregation in the South might feel pretty similar to a rural congregation, say, in Pennsylvania. And so that might be sort of one of the distinctions. I think that this idea of sort of a distinctive Southernness is, I think, both really important and really complicated and loaded. And so, the South is really this unique region, but I think also I always hesitate to move too far into sort of Southern exceptionalism for a number of reasons. But I do think that there are really a lot of shared experiences, both across the South and then between sort of smaller congregations in the South and smaller congregations elsewhere in the country.
There is a Southern culture, though, and my travels and experience, there is a Southern, whatever that is, and I love the term you just used, Southern exceptionalism. I have to remember that. But I've also noticed in some of the congregations that I've gone pre-pandemic and we've been working in, that there's this significant amount of baby boomers moving from the Northeast into some of these congregations in the South and literally changing the nature of the congregation. I remember doing High Holidays many years ago in Wilmington, North Carolina, and having a conversation with somebody who's been working at the congregation for years. And we got to talking about this after a Friday night service, and she said, yes, the whole nature of our congregation has changed because all those Yankees are moving in. And what's your experience with that, and how have you helped, or does the Institute help negotiate or deal with these changing demographics with these smaller congregations in the South?
So I'll give full disclosure that I am also a Yankee who moved south. I do think that demographic.
It's okay. Where are you from? Where are you from?
I'm originally from Pennsylvania.
Where?
I'm originally from Pennsylvania.
Where in Pennsylvania?
Upper Bucks County, about 50 miles north of Philadelphia.
Oh, wait, so I'm a Philadelphian. Okay, so you speak the language.
Wonderful. Yes, absolutely.
Wawa, soft pretzels,
Wawa,
mustard,
hoagies,
the Eagles,
soft
the
pretzels,
Phillies.
water ice.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so you speak the language.
Not so
go
much
ahead,
the sports, but I am a fan of gritty, if that counts. So.
No, you and my son would have. Anyway. Let's get off of that. Most people don't care about that, but I'm glad you have the true soul of Philadelphia.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Absolutely. So I think the demographic shift that you're identifying is really interesting, and it's one that I have definitely been aware of, but that I think, is something that we're sort of continuing to understand as that's sort of continuing to happen. And obviously, folks, when they retire, they often want to move to a warmer climate. The South is filled with warm climates. So we're not necessarily doing a ton of work of helping people negotiate those interpersonal relationships, but we're of course always available to help folks. I think that, if you're a person who's moving to the South who maybe isn't aware of the history of the South, and especially how the history of the South can really inform our understanding of the United States, I always hope that folks who move South really become really embedded in those communities and really begin to understand the history of this place, because you can't understand the United States without understanding the South.
The Institute has such a rich reservoir of information and resources. Does the Institute work with the existing denominations, the Reform movement, conservative movement, Reconstructionists? Do you have tentacles in there? Are you involved in the seminaries? Are you doing any presentations to alert rabbinic students, cantorial students of the history and the richness of some of these areas?
So we certainly have, some institutional connections to those places. We're not necessarily as embedded in the way that you're describing, but we do make sure that sort of the denominations are aware of us, and it is always my goal that more and more people understand the history of the Jewish South, both Jews and non-Jews.
So, Nora Katz, the Director of Heritage and Interpretation for the Institute of Southern Jewish Life. Before we end, what if you could, one message that you would like to make sure that people who understand what the Institute does, its value, what would that message be?
The ISJL really exists to serve this very unique sort of pocket of American Jews. And I would say that from my perspective in the specific work that I do, the most important thing that we do is expand people's understanding of what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be a Jewish person in the United States, and I think by extension, what it means to be American. As I was mentioning, sort of talking about the Jewish immigration story to the South is so different from what you learn in school about how everyone came from Eastern Europe in the 1880s through Ellis Island and lived in the Lower East Side. That's an important story. But there's a whole other story and a broader story about what it means to be Jewish in America. And so my hope is that the work that we do can inform how people understand their own Jewish identities, their own American identities, and perhaps sort of expand their minds a little bit about, what it means to be an American.
Nora, thank you very much. Continued success and good luck in spreading the word.
Thank you.
And really enjoy Jackson, Mississippi, and say hello to Macy, and just take care of yourself. And especially in this pandemic, stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you. And,
you too. And keep on rooting for those Flyers. Okay? Thanks, Nora. Thanks all of you again for watching and listening to today's edition of Seekers of Meaning, the TV show and podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. Remember, the show is available now as a TV podcast on the Roku streaming service. And again, we welcome your comments and suggestions, and you can email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. We invite you again to visit our Jewish Sacred Aging Facebook page, and if you'd like to make a tax-free donation to help support our work and these podcasts, go to the homepage, jewishsacredaging.com, and click on the donate button. Seekers of Meaning is produced at the Broadcast Center of Lubetkin Media Companies in beautiful Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And we give a big shout out and thank you to our producer, Steve Lubetkin. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address. I look forward to greeting you again on our next Seekers of Meaning TV show and podcast. Until that time, shalom, stay safe, stay healthy, everyone.